I feel greatly honored and deeply moved to be awarded the Feltrinelli International Prize for Poetry. This European award comes to me at a time when war has returned to Europe. I take the title for my talk, during which I will read some of my poems, from a poem by W.B. Yeats on being asked for a war poem. The poem begins, "I think it better that in times like these a poet's mouth be silent." Yeats wrote this poem in early 1915, partly as a reaction against all the bad patriotic verse prompted by the First World War. But in fact, he would go on to engage profoundly with that war in his poetry. He discovered that he could not be silent about times like these, about a European cataclysm which included violence and civil war in Ireland. To return to our own times, but again with a backward look, Vladimir Putin's wicked invasion of Ukraine obliges me to name that glittering quartet of Russian poets who were hounded and tormented by his murderous predecessor, Joseph Stalin. I'm referring, of course, to Anna Akhmatova, Boris Pasternak, Marina Tsvetaeva, and Osip Mandelstam. In Stalin's terrors and purges, millions perished through starvation, execution, imprisonment, torture, slavery. In a 1925 poem, Akhmatova writes, "There are such easy ways to leave this life, to burn to an end without pain or thought. But a Russian poet has no such luck. A bullet is more likely to show his winged soul the way to heaven, or else the shaggy paw of voiceless terror will squeeze the life out of his heart as if it were a sponge." In that nightmarish darkness, our four poets' unbreakable integrity and spiritual incorruptibility blaze out like a sunburst. But they paid a terrible price. Mandelstam died in a labor camp. Tsvetaeva was driven to suicide. Pasternak, who was forbidden to travel to Sweden to receive his Nobel Prize, Pasternak died in opprobrium. As her distinguished translator D.M. Thomas points out, only Akhmatova lived long enough to receive the openly expressed love of her countrymen and to find joy in the knowledge of poetry's endurance. Thomas asks a profound question. Can it be by chance that the worst of times found the best of poets to wage the war for eternal truth and human dignity? The same question might be asked of Vasyl Stus, one of Ukraine's most celebrated and defiant poets during the Soviet rule. He joined protests against the arrests of Ukrainian intelligentsia and was expelled from his PhD studies and refused publication. He campaigned tirelessly for free speech and cultural pluralism. Arrested and charged with anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, he was sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp and a further 3 years exile. In papers smuggled from prison, he proclaimed, "I had no intention of bowing my head down, whatever happened. Behind me was Ukraine, my oppressed people, whose honor I had to defend or perish." Stus wrote many poems in prison, saying of his work that, quote, "the debris of torment might give birth to flowers." He was arrested again in 1980 and thrown into isolation in 1985. He died shortly afterwards on hunger strike. Stus's poems are much quoted today. He also wrote, quote, "There is a fight. I'm on the battlefield where all my soldiers are the words I wield." 50 years earlier, Joseph Stalin had so many Ukrainian writers murdered. They are known as, this wonderful phrase, the executed Renaissance. The executed Renaissance. Tyrants fear the word. Around the world, they imprison journalists and intellectuals, writers and poets. If I were to name one repressive regime, I would, in fairness, have to name them all, and that would make too long a list. I shall confine myself to a personal story. In 2017, I was humbled to share the PEN Pinter Prize with Vasyl Stus, an Iranian poet condemned in 2010 to 20 years in prison simply because of her Baha'i faith and her work on behalf of the Baha'i community. Her poems can be desolate. She says, "No one listens, no one hears this wingless bird." In my address, which I called the Songs for Dead Children, I did indeed call Vasyl a songbird trapped in a cage. I said that her incarceration by the Iranian authorities was a sin against the light. Miraculously, by the time I gave my address in London in 2017, Vasyl had been released. Through a video link, she was able to join our gathering like a burst of birdsong. But recently, I have received heartbreaking news. The Iranian thought police are again on the rampage. Dozens of Baha'i followers have been arrested, among them Vasyl Stus. Yes, simply for what she believes, the winner of the 2017 PEN Pinter Prize for an International Writer of Courage, has once again been incarcerated. Let us all cry out for her release. May her quiet voice silence the taunts and lies of the bullies. Here are 4 lines of hers. "I have written a message on a nasturtium leaf and hung it on my door like a charm. It says, there's a warm heart waiting here and a mother's open arms." Now to come home. In the north of Ireland, our civil war lasted for 30 destructive years. We christened this mayhem the Troubles. The Troubles belong to the dark history of European conflict. 3,500 people died. Many more were wounded. Many were displaced. It will take generations for the wounds to heal. From the beginning, my poet friends and I resisted the temptation to hitch a ride on yesterday's headlines, to write the poem of the latest atrocity. Perhaps Yeats's example was in our minds. We also learned from each other how complex the situation was and is, how inadequate the political certainties. We knew there was no point in versifying opinion and giving people what they wanted to hear. We believed that poetry, the opposite of propaganda, should encourage people to think and feel for themselves. We hated shallow or opportunistic writings, which we came to call Trouble's trash. We believed that even when generated by the best of intentions, bad poetry about the sufferings of fellow citizens would be an impertinence. We also disliked the notion that civic unrest might be good for poetry, or poetry a solace for the broken-hearted. A civil war puts everyone in the front line, and there is no split between the public and the personal. In January 1976, 10 workmen were taking their usual route home from a factory. Their bus was stopped. The gunman asked each of them his religion. One man, a Catholic, was told to run away up the road. The other 10 were lined up and machine-gunned. That scene of carnage was shown on television screens around the world. By pure chance, I met in a Belfast pub the following day the cameraman who had filmed the bloody aftermath. Just a few weeks ago, nearly 50 years after the massacre, I wrote this short poem, perhaps about not being silent, or about the need to speak with care and attention. The following day, I met him in the Crown by chance the following day, the cameraman whose film had shown around the world our blood-drenched Tower Macadam. And when I asked him how, in nightmare's aftermath, he could compose himself, I take out my light meter and I focus the lens, he said the following day. My Troubles poems mainly respond to certain terrible events, but sometimes to more direct political challenges. In 1976, I met in a pub Betty Williams and Mairead Corrigan of the Northern Irish Peace People, shortly after they had won the Nobel Peace Prize. I congratulated them on their great honor and promised them a poem for their movement's newspaper, Peace News. That evening, unbelievably, I chanced upon an appropriate poem by the Latin poet Tibullus, Quis fuit horrendos primus qui protulit enses. I translated Tibullus's opening lines as, who was responsible for the very first arms deal? The man of iron who thought of marketing the sword? The poem continues, I want to live until the white hairs shine above a pensioner's memories of better days. Meanwhile, I would like peace to be my partner on the farm, peace personified, oxen under the curved yoke, compost for the vines, grape juice turning into wine. Vintage years handed down from father to son, hoe and ploughshare gleaming, while in some dark corner rust keeps the soldiers' grisly weapons in their place. Alas, the gunmen and bombers ignored the peace people's proposals and the pastoral quietude of Tibullus. The violence continued for too many years. A French writer once asked me, what side are the poets on? The true poets resisted demands to take sides. They listened to one another. Poem spoke to poem, poet spoke to poet. Together the poets lived out the cultural intricacies of life in Northern Ireland. Poetic conversations continue to this day. When the Good Friday Agreement was painstakingly achieved, I felt it had an almost poetic complexity. What we call the peace process is, after all, a process. It is a long way from being over. In August 1994, it was rumoured that there might be an IRA ceasefire. At the time, I was reading the passage in the Iliad where the old king Priam bravely visits the mighty general of the Greeks, Achilles, to beg for the body of his son Hector, whom Achilles has killed in combat. Priam, in his fragility, awakens in Achilles memories of his own father and rekindles the gentler emotions he has had to suppress in order to be a great general. The Iliad is probably our greatest poem about war and death, and this episode is, for me, the soul of this astonishing work. Ceasefire. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed and, for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present, home to Troy at daybreak. When they had eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty, as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. Latin and Greek poets have helped me to bring times like these into my own poetry. Homer has haunted me for more than 60 years. As a schoolboy, I relished the Bronze Age music, the bumpy hexameters, the clash of the broad vowels, the way lips and tongue are vigorously exercised, hammer and tongs. And I adored the stories. In middle age, I returned to the classics after a neglect that had lasted for a quarter of a century. From the outset, in my Homeric poems, I pushed against the narrative momentum. The Iliad and the Odyssey are page-turners. We go on reading to find out what happens next. But in my poems, I freeze-frame passages to release their lyric potential. Homer has enabled me to write belated lamentations for my father and mother, as well as to comment obliquely on the Northern Irish troubles. And I have interwoven Homeric landscapes with the Irish landscape. In my poem, Moly, I describe myself reading and translating Homer in the west of Ireland, his epics of war and peace. I refer in the poem to wildflowers and to Inishturk, an island off the western coast of Ireland, and perhaps Homer's mysterious plant, moly, is a symbol for healing. Here's my poem, Moly. Translating the Iliad at Corrigan, Book 20, Achilles' Rampage, I turn to the Odyssey for relief and stroll from my sheepskin armchair down the overgrown, pebbly path to search among goosegrass and centaury and scarlet pimpernel for that milk-white flower with black root, so difficult for mortal man to find, occult herb and antidote for spells, Circe's spells. Nobody knows exactly what it is. Nobody knows exactly what it is, but I shall recognize it if it's here. Its name among the gods is Moly, and Inishturk becomes Ithaca. I now want to express further gratitude to the country that has awarded me this prize. I want to put on record what Italy has meant to me and my poetry during difficult times. Since the 1980s, my wife and I have been regular visitors to Italy, the guests of our friend Ronald Ewart. His lovely old casa is in the middle of Cardozo, a hilltop village in the Garfagnana region of Tuscany. Near the casa, there's a magical walk along a wooded path to a waterfall. In my poem, The Waterfall, I imagine this Cardozo locale as the ideal place for reading my poems, and perhaps as representing some qualities I would like them to have. The Waterfall. If you were to read my poems, all of them, I mean my life's work, at the one city, in the one place, let it be here by this half-hearted waterfall that allows each pebbly basin its separate say, damp stones and syllables. Then, as it grows dark and you go home past overgrown vineyards and chestnut trees, suppliers once of crossbeams, moon-shaped nuts, flour, and crackly leaves for mattresses. Leave them here on the page in your mind's eye, lit like the fireflies at the waterfall, a wall of stars. One day, when I was leaning out of the bathroom window to admire the surrounding mountains, I spotted an elderly neighbor tending his vines beyond the last houses. This seemed such an ancient image, and it became associated in my mind with an ancient feeling. Old Cesare reminded me of my father, then of Laertes, the father of Odysseus. In the Odyssey, Laertes is in mourning for his son Odysseus. At first, he doesn't realize that Odysseus is standing in front of him, alive and well, until Quote, Laertes recognized his son, and, weak at the knees, dizzy, flung his arms around the neck of great Odysseus, who drew the old man fainting to his breast and held him there, and cradled like driftwood the bones of his dwindling father. So in fact, my Homeric adventure began in Cardozo in Italy with that poem. Cardozo also deepened my enthusiasm for Italian poets, such as obviously Montale, Ungaretti, Quasimodo, and the underrated Pascoli, laureate of the Garfagnana region. I really enjoyed translating with a crib a short lyric by Giovanni Pascoli. This is a short translation, so I'll read it as a tribute to the Garfagnana. The skylark far away up there in dawnlight, sky wanders. Arias fall on the farmhouse while smoke sways raggedly this way and that. Far away up there, the tiny eye takes in furrows rolling over in brown munificence behind converging teams of white oxen. A particular sod on black soggy land flashes in sunlight like a mirror fragment. The philosophical laborer binding sheaves cocks an ear for the cuckoo's recitatives. I like that rhyme, sheaves and recitatives. I'll end by reading from Etruria, a poem set in Cardozo. The poem alludes to people who live and work there, to animals, insects, plants, food, to traditional crafts, to arts and artifacts. Although there are one or two darker images in my poem Etruria, I think it's ultimately a celebration of deep European history and deep civilization, the opposite of war. It's also a poem about my love for Italy. And this is the most profound way I have of thanking you from the bottom of my heart for the great honor you have bestowed on me. Etruria. Pavesi's English poems, an English setter barking, too hot and clammy to read, sleep, dander, so snap my walking stick in two and lay it out beside my long bones in an ossuary that tells a story. The apprentice ivory carver's yarn, for instance, who etched those elderly twinkling Chinese pilgrims on a walnut, shell crinkles their only obstacle, globetrotters in my palm, the kernel still rattling. You can find me under the sellotaped map fold stuck with dog hairs, and close to a mulberry bush the women tended, coddling between their breasts the silkworm's filaments, vulnerable bobbins. Was it a hummingbird or a hummingbird moth mistook my navel for some chubby convolvulus? Paolo steps from his casa like an astronaut and stoops with smoky bellows among his bees. Gin, acacia honey, last year's sloes, crimson slipping its gravity like the satellite that swims in and out of the hanging hornet nets, traps, then jukes between midnight plains and shooting stars. The melon Adowa leaves me on the windowsill, gift wrapped in a paper bag and moonlight, ripens in moon breezes, the pipistrelle's whooshes, my own breathing, and the insomniac aspens. I escape the amorous mongrel with dew claws and vanish where once the privy stood, my caftan snagging on the spiral staircase down to the small hours when house and I get into bed together. My mattress on the floor, crickets, scorpion shapes in their moonlit square. My space in this cellar beneath old rafters and old stones, Etruria. Nightmares, cesspit, the mosquito buzz of sleep. Thank you, thank you, thank you.